Curiosity stirred first, soft as a breeze slipping through frostbitten grass, when Colt Remington noticed an unusual shape curled at the edge of the snowfield. He had been making his solitary morning rounds, boots crunching through the Wyoming silence, when that small, motionless figure caught his eye and drew him closer without quite knowing why. Something in the stillness felt wrong, as though the land itself held its breath. And when he knelt beside the bundle of pale cloth and trembling breaths, the world shifted. A young woman lay half-buried, her lashes frosted, her lips cracked, her voice barely a thread of sound drifting into the cold air as she whispered, "I can't move my legs." Her name, he learned later, was Lila Mae Dorset, only 23, slight in frame but carrying a fear so deep it seemed older than she was. In that moment, she looked like a snow-drowned wildflower fighting to stay alive. Colt, a broad-shouldered mountain man with a face shaped by weather and grief, felt a tug in his chest he hadn't felt since before his brother died last winter. He wasn't a man easily shaken. Life in the mountains carved its people into stone. But her small hands curled near her chest, her shallow breaths, the resignation in her eyes, all of it struck him harder than the cold ever had. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. He simply slid his arms beneath her, surprised by how light she felt, like lifting a memory. She winced as her legs shifted, but she did not complain. Her trust, unspoken, unearned, settled over him with a weight he had no words for. He carried her across drifts and fallen branches, the wind biting his face as though urging him to move faster. She clung faintly to his coat, seeking warmth without daring to hold on fully. By the time he reached his secluded cabin nestled against a rock ridge, Lila's breaths had softened into a fragile rhythm. Colt pushed the door open with his shoulder, stepped inside, and lowered her gently onto the fur-lined cot near the stove. His cabin was simple. Wooden shelves, iron kettle, neatly stacked pelts. Yet the moment she entered, it felt as though the space rearranged itself to make room for her presence. Lila blinked slowly at the warmth, her eyes tracing the shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Her voice emerged again, thin but trying to be steady. I'm sorry. I don't mean to trouble you." Colt shook his head, kneeling beside the cot as he examined her legs. "You're not trouble." His tone was low, quiet, as if speaking too loudly might shatter something delicate between them. "You're hurt. That's all that matters right now." He noticed faint bruising along her calf, the kind that suggested a wagon wheel had clipped her or she had fallen from a moving seat. Her boots were worn at the toes, her coat thin, too thin for a woman walking alone through winter. She watched him with wary eyes, the kind that had learned to defend themselves long before anyone protected her. Shame flickered in her expression, but it rooted not in wrongdoing, only in having needed someone. Colt fetched warm snowmelt water from the stove and soaked a cloth, then pressed it carefully to her legs. Lila inhaled sharply, and he paused, waiting for her to adjust. She gave a faint nod, allowing him to continue. Every movement he made was steady, careful, gentle in a way that didn't match his rugged exterior. He didn't fill the silence with words. He wasn't the kind of man who believed words fixed broken things. He believed in actions. Small, deliberate, honest actions. Lila watched him work, eyes fluttering between gratitude and uncertainty. "I shouldn't have been out there," she whispered, voice trembling more from emotion than pain. "They said I was just taking up space. That I should find somewhere else to be useful." Colt didn't look up yet, but his jaw tightened. He recognized the tone, a person repeating someone else's cruelty as though it were truth. "Who said that?" She hesitated, fingers twisting weakly in the blanket. "The landlady at the boarding house. After the wagon accident. She said I slowed things down. That I was making problems. I tried to walk to town, but my legs—" She swallowed, eyes glistening. "They stopped listening to me." Colt placed the cloth back into the basin and finally met her gaze. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a stillness that made her own breathing easier. "You didn't deserve that." A faint, disbelieving laugh escaped her. "Most folks don't think much of what I deserve." He recognized that kind of wound. Not the physical one, those healed with warmth and time. The other kind, carved by voices sharper than winter wind. Colt understood because he carried his own version of it, the guilt of not reaching his brother before the blizzard claimed him. That guilt lived in his shadow. But looking at Lila, He sensed a different pain, one tied to years of being overlooked, mishandled, and blamed for her own fragility. He wrung out the cloth and pressed it to her shin again, this time with a softer touch, as though offering reassurance through his fingertips. Lila didn't pull away. Instead, she let her eyes drift shut for a moment, trusting the warmth spreading slowly through her stiff limbs. When she opened them, she found Colt studying her with a quiet intensity, not invasive but searching, as though trying to understand how someone so gentle had survived so much. "You said you couldn't move your legs," he murmured. "Does the feeling come and go?" "A little," she admitted. "Sometimes there's warmth. Other times nothing at all." "We'll take it slow," he said simply. Something loosened in her chest, not quite relief but something close. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but inside the cabin, the air held a tentative stillness. Lila shifted slightly, her legs responding with faint tingles. "Thank you," she whispered, sincere and fragile. "You didn't have to stop for me." Colt shook his head. "Couldn't just leave you there." She offered him a small, exhausted smile, the kind that carried more weight than 100 spoken promises. In that quiet exchange, something unspoken began to form between them, tender but real, like the early stirring of spring beneath layers of frost. Her legs weren't healed, not yet. Her trust wasn't either. But the cabin felt warmer now, as though her presence had softened the edges of the room and the loneliness inside him. And while the fire crackled and her breathing steadied, Colt felt a strange certainty settle deep within. Whatever had brought her to him on that winter morning was only the beginning of something neither of them fully understood. But both, silently, wanted to follow where it might lead. Curiosity flickered again the next morning, not from Colt this time, but from Lila as she watched him stoke the stove with a measured calm that made the small cabin feel steadier than the world she had known. Her legs tingled beneath the blankets, a faint promise of returning strength. Colt glanced at her every so often, as though checking that she was still there, still breathing, still safe. The silence between them had grown warm, not from avoidance, but from a shared understanding neither knew how to articulate. Yet beneath that warmth, a quiet unease moved like a shadow across Colt's eyes, as though some memory or instinct warned him that peace rarely lasted long on the mountain. The day had barely stretched its pale winter light across the snow when a distant rhythm of hoofbeats reached his ears. Colt froze, senses sharpening. Lila noticed immediately, her fingers tightening around the blanket. His gaze shifted toward the window, narrowing. Something in the cadence of the hoofbeats told him these weren't travelers seeking shelter. These were men riding with purpose, cold, clipped, familiar in a way that made Lila's breath catch. She lifted herself slightly, dread creeping through her. "Colt, I think I know who it might be." He turned to her. "You recognize the sound?" "I recognize the men," she whispered, voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "They're the ones from the wagon. The ones who left me behind." Shame flickered across her features, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she feared her trouble would spill into his quiet life. Colt moved to her side immediately, kneeling so that his face leveled with hers. "You're not a burden," he said quietly, "and no one gets to hurt you again." The hoofbeats grew louder, puncturing the serene mountain air. Lila's heartbeat echoed the rhythm, each thud sharp and irregular. Colt helped her sit up properly, his hand steady beneath her elbow. She drew in a fragile breath, bracing herself. She had spent years bracing for unkindness, but this time felt different, because she wasn't preparing to endure alone. When the horses finally stopped outside, Colt rose and stepped to the door. Lila watched him, noticing the way he squared his shoulders, the way his posture shifted from gentle caretaker to unwavering protector. He opened the door just enough to step out, closing it behind him with a soft click that sent a ripple of fear through her ribs. She wanted to call out, to stand beside him, but her legs hadn't fully trusted her yet. Still, she leaned forward, listening. Outside, the air crackled with the tension of unsaid threats. 3 men sat astride their horses, their faces drawn tight with arrogance and annoyance. The leader, a heavy-set man with narrowed eyes, jerked his chin at Colt. "We're looking for a girl who wandered off from our wagon yesterday. Real nuisance, that one." His voice held the dismissive cruelty Lila had heard too many times. Colt didn't flinch. There's no girl here you own. The man scoffed. Not what I said. She owes us for slowing down the trip. We just want her back, that's all. You left her in the snow, Colt replied, the steel in his tone unmoving. That tells me everything I need to know. The second man stepped forward, sneering. You don't want trouble, mountain man. Just hand her over. Colt didn't move. The winter wind tugged at his coat, but his stance was solid, anchored by a conviction deeper than fear. She's not going anywhere with you. Inside, Lila pushed herself upright, legs trembling. She couldn't listen to these men decide her fate again, not while Colt defended her. Gritting her teeth, she swung her legs over the edge of the cot. The floor felt icy under her feet, and pain lanced up her calves, but she stayed standing. Every part of her felt as though she was stepping out of a past that had shackled her too long. With slow determination, she crossed the small room and unlatched the door. The cold air slapped her cheeks the instant she stepped out, but she didn't falter. When the men saw her, their expressions sharpened with impatience and disdain. There she is, the leader barked. Get over here, girl. Lila lifted her chin, breath visible in delicate bursts. No, she said, voice small but unwavering. Her legs quivered beneath her, but she stood her ground. I'm not going anywhere with you. The men exchanged irritated glances, clearly not expecting resistance. The second man muttered something crude under his breath and nudged his horse forward, but Colt stepped closer to Lila, his presence firm as an oak. The look he gave the riders carried a quiet warning, one shaped by grief, resilience, and a promise he didn't intend to break. You heard her, he said softly, though the softness was more daunting than a shout. She chose to stay. The quiet that followed was thick and brittle. The riders weighed their chances, studied Colt's steadiness, and sensed a resolve far stronger than their bluster. One by one, their confidence crumbled. Without another word, they tugged their reins and turned away, disappearing down the snowy ridge with the bitter wind swallowing their curses. When the last echo of hoofbeats faded, Lila exhaled shakily, her body swaying. Colt caught her before she fell, his arms strong and warm as he steadied her. She leaned into him without hesitation, relief flooding through her like a thaw. You stood, he murmured, awe threading through his voice. Because you believed I could, she whispered, tears blurring her vision. He guided her back inside, helping her sit near the stove. She looked at him, truly looked, realizing that somewhere between the snowfield and this doorway, the loneliness she had carried for years had begun to loosen. He knelt beside her, meeting her eyes with a gentleness that made her chest swell with something new, something hopeful. I'm glad you're here, Lila, Colt said quietly. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling but purposeful. I'm glad you found me. The words hung between them, soft and warm, blooming like sunlight after a long winter storm. When she smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile, it felt like the beginning of something bright and enduring, a promise of days filled with healing rather than hurt. And as the fire crackled, and their joined hands rested between them, Lila realized her legs were no longer the only part of her learning how to stand again. Her heart was, too, steadying itself beside the one person who saw her worth before she ever believed in it herself.